Hello, and welcome to another episode of Thinking Historically About, where we really try to think historically about a particular topic in history. Today, we're going to be thinking historically about the topic of slave resistance and looking at both the lives of the enslaved and how people resisted the system of slavery. Uh, I'm incredibly excited to have this conversation with Dr. Manisha Sinha, who is the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and the president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. Dr. Sinha, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Zach.
To kind of give some personal context here, what drew you to this topic in history? As a as you're exploring your dissertation, even I see like that's kind of where things begin to blossom in this subject. What drew you to the story of American slavery and the history and kind of the experiences of the enslaved?
So, I guess I've always been interested in history and knew that I wanted to major in history and continue a doctoral work in history. But when I was growing up, we were really influenced by the aftermath of the civil rights movement
Mm-hmm.
and the ways in which Dr. King had used Indian ideas of nonviolent struggle. And I read a lot of, civil rights icons like Dr. King, Malcolm X, or Anne Moody's coming of age in Mississippi. And just looking at this question of race, democracy, and citizenship, I kind of worked my way back to slavery and became very interested in looking at the ways in which enslaved people resisted at a much earlier point, long before the civil rights revolution.
Yeah, and there probably is so much continuity in obviously there's different eras. You have a century or more in between, but it I can see there's that kind of logical trajectory backwards to the story of slave resistance. So I would thought about this unit a number of years ago, and it was really after reading your book, The Slave's Cause. And so I'm gonna try to grab it without dropping everything here. But so this book, I would tell students just changed the way that I saw the story of American slavery because of the way that even the title, it's the slave's cause. It shifts the story of abolition from like a William Lloyd Garrison perspective, to what did enslaved people do to resist their enslavement. And so, one, thank you for shifting my own paradigm. That was just incredibly enlightening for me. But two, it's why we have the students engaging with this question. And so, let me read the question here, and then I'd love just to hear your thoughts on how you might approach a question like this. So, students are tasked to answer this: how did enslaved people resist their enslavement, and why is this historically significant?
Yes, so most historians of slavery know that enslaved people resisted their enslavement on a daily basis, what they call day to day resistance to slavery. And then, of course, they also study, the bigger slave revolts, and they look at the number of fugitive slaves, what we call freedom seekers today, made their way out of the South to the North. And when I was writing my book, The Slave's Cause, which is really a history of abolition, I realized that the people who were central to that story were enslaved people themselves. They were the original abolitionists. They're the ones who start resisting slavery at the point of enslavement. Right at the west coast of Africa through the slave trade. A lot had been written on African involvement in the African slave trade, but I think they hadn't done justice to the amount of resistance against the slave trade by those Africans who were caught up in that vortex. So, right from that moment in history, we can see the enslaved playing an important role in abolition. And then looking at specifically this question of fugitivity, right? And looking at the number of enslaved people who simply ran away, voted with their feet, and joined the abolition movement. And that's where I think it becomes really politically significant because it was not just like random people running away to random places, a lot of them, of course, most of them sought free spaces wherever they could find, right? Whether it was Indian territory or even Mexico, and sometimes even the Caribbean. But those who made it to the free states in the north, a lot of them became very active in the abolition movement, and were what I call in my book fugitive slave abolitionists. So you can see how slave resistance kind of feeds into the abolition movement in the United States, which becomes this sort of radical interracial movement because a lot of these fugitive slaves bring back stories of, resistance. They become lecturers and speakers, some quite famous, like Frederick Douglass, but there were hundreds and hundreds of them who actually joined the abolition movement, wrote their narratives, joined the abolitionist lecture circuit. So, in that sense, I would say slave resistance is politically significant. And then this becomes a huge matter of controversy between the North and South, the implementation of the fugitive slave laws and the rendition of fugitive slaves back to the South. So it becomes like a stepping stone leading to the Civil War. So the simple act of slave resistance has this sort of tremendous impact nationally and even internationally, one could argue, for those who lectured abroad and tried to shame American slaveholders, had an important impact on the abolition movement and had an important impact on the coming of the Civil War.
So I feel like when many of us like first engage with this topic of slave resistance, we tend to think of revolt or violence. And what I appreciate about like the acknowledgement of day to day or running away is that one, that they're much more commonplace, and and two, like they're not headline makers, unless it's the advertisements in a newspaper for runaway slaves. So I'm curious, if could you just help us understand a little bit more about those maybe smaller day-to-day forms of resistance? Like what were those, what did they look like, and why did they matter?
So there were a couple of historians who wrote about day to day resistance to slavery in what was then called the Journal of Negro History. Now we call it the Journal of African American History, a long time ago. But many historians of slavery sort of did not take into account the significance of day to day resistance. They thought it was just enslaved people blowing off steam and therefore had no political significance. But actually, those daily forms of resistance were also politically significant. A lot of times enslaved people would even take from their masters and then sell it in a kind of a black market, an underground market, and they developed their own moral economy of these exchanges with itinerant peddlers and others. And so they were really, even in terms of simply like not working efficiently, not working well, deliberately sabotaging farm tools or animals, or feigning illness. All these things are things that enslaved people deployed to resist this kind of very cruel and harsh labor regimen, which was plantation slavery. It becomes politically significant in moments of external danger. So, for instance, during the Civil War, when the South is fighting for slavery, is involved in this enormous battle for slavery. When enslaved people start doing this in the Southern home front, it actually has a political impact, right? They can affect all kinds of things by simply employing their day-to-day resistance, because the broader context has changed at that time, the broader political and historical context. So I think it would be wise not to undermine the significance of daily resistance to slavery, or see it as sort of apolitical, as one historian of slavery, influential one, did for a very long time. But in fact, when you see the Southern home front crumbling during the Civil War, enslaved people and their resistance played a part in that.
I have a feeling that many students have, prior to this unit, have probably heard of the Underground Railroad. This is a very common thing to teach in elementary school, and I mean they're exciting stories of following a star in the night, or going through rivers. And but one thing that I don't think we really grapple with is the political significance or the historical significance. And so why, and I think it was even you in your writing, saying that running away might have been the most frequent form of resistance. And so why? What makes running away a form of resistance that will lead to this political significance?
Yes, so as far as the slave South is concerned, I think running away was far more common and frequent than slave rebellions, which
Mhm.
were sort of episodic
Yeah.
and occurred once in a while. And they were significant too in their own way, but the running away was something that really undermined the slave regime from within and created this kind of political problem for southern slaveholders when northern states refused to abide by southern laws of slavery, and they applied the freedom principle, the free soil principle, which is, we have abolished slavery, so if an enslaved person comes to our territory, they're therefore declared free. And this creates tremendous tensions between North and South. And in fact, if you read some of the ordinances of secession of the southern states, they specifically mention fugitive slaves and the North's refusal to implement the federal fugitive slave laws as a reason to secede from the Union. So this is a tremendous political impact that one enslaved person voting with their feet has on running away. Now, historians, I think, did not take this very seriously. The Underground Railroad was seen as, more in the realm of myth and romance than of serious historical scholarship. And a lot of them said, well, if you look at the U.S. Census records, just a few hundred enslaved people, mainly from the upper South states bordering the free states, fled slavery. So it was not that significant. But a lot of new work has shown that that is a real undercount. Firstly, relying on the census for an illegal activity is probably not the best thing to do. And a lot of historians who have now been studying this in great detail, looking at runaway ads mainly, but looking at combing through newspapers, have started compiling their own data sets. And we found that, in fact, running away was far more common. The numbers were higher than were previously thought. And I think Ed Baptist at Cornell University has a website, Freedom on the Move, which he's collaborating with other historians of slavery, where they're simply compiling the numbers of enslaved people and looking through these runaway ads. And every time you turn around, their numbers increase. So it was pretty significant in terms of not just enslaved people sort of joining the abolition movement, but also creating this political conflict between the North and South. So if people say that that is apolitical, or, as one historian of slavery speculated, that it actually made slavery stronger because the most innovative and enterprising enslaved people simply ran away instead of leading a slave rebellion and challenging the system, that somehow running away was not challenging the system of slavery, but in fact it was. In fact, it did in the end challenge the system of slavery.
Yeah. Oh wow. Now I want to dive into a scholarly debate, but we maybe won't. But that's interesting that there's like these multiple perspectives on the significance of running away. So when thinking about slave resistance, do you have a go-to, either like a specific primary source or even just like a type of source that you find most helpful?
So, of course, the runaway slave ads that you mentioned are really important. And, you can glean so much by just reading the ad for a runaway slave, because it's not just saying, oh, so and so's run away and, we're looking for them and here's the reward if you find this enslaved person. But many times they describe the enslaved person in great depth. Like they will talk about, either limbs missing or whip scars on the back, or chipped off ear or something. And so, in a way, they were recording their own brutality in the runaway ad, showing how much abuse was possible, physical abuse of enslaved people. And the go to source for me, of course, besides the runaway ads, I love to have students just sort of read that. And they're so shocked when they read it because the descriptions are so jarring. But the first person who came across this and decided to do something with it was the abolitionist Theodore Weld, who, along with his wife, who was an abolitionist feminist, Angelina Grimke Weld, and her sister, Sarah Grimke, they were feminists also, and they had been slave owners. They belonged to a slaveholding family in South Carolina before they gave up, before they left, rather, South Carolina and disavowed slaveholding and became abolitionists. They compiled this book called American Slavery as It Is, which was published in the 1830s. And, if you don't have time to sit and read through these newspapers, that's what these people did. They simply went through contemporary newspapers and compiled a book of these newspaper ads. And then sometimes they even had narratives that enslaved people told, not like those formal published slave narratives, but just brief descriptions of their life under slavery and their experiences. And you can really hear the voices of the enslaved. So it's kind of an interesting collection because on the one hand, it shows you the brutality of slavery with those ads and those descriptions of slaves, but it also shows the resilience of Black people under slavery who then left behind testimony of their own resistance.
Yeah, I mean, and that juxtaposition of the oppression and the brutality and the resilience, I see in the slave ads as well. So one of the documents students will look at is a set of ads from New Orleans in 1857. And what's fascinating is in the effort to dehumanize, like calling for a reward for a human that ran away. There's a sense of humanity in the descriptions. We learn that one of these men is a really good accountant and can speak French and English, and we learn another one is literate because the ad says watch out because he can write his own pass. And so you learn these aspects of their humanity in the very effort to dehumanize them through an advertisement, which is, it just really helps us kind of wrestle with the complexity of the moment.
That's such a good point that you made out there. Besides the attempt to dehumanize and what it shows us about slavery, describing an individual, a human being, shows you how awful slavery was. This willingness to reduce human beings, some who were talented and skilled, as you point out, to reduce them, to commodify them, to reduce them to being purchasable commodities. I mean, then the horrors even more. That here's a person with talents, with skills, with a knowledge sometimes, who is, not just some kind of dumb brute, that you're completely commodifying and dehumanizing. So yeah, it's what the Black abolitionist James W.C. Pennington called the chattel principle, the principle of reducing human beings to commodities.
Do you think that there's a perspective that, I mean, even maybe in your more recent scholarship or what you're seeing other historians do, a perspective that maybe still isn't getting enough, attention about, when we think about slave resistance? Like, what are we still missing when we're exploring this topic?
So I think a lot of times when historians talk about slave resistance, they feel that somehow this is challenging the real oppression of slavery, and that this whole resistance framework is passe, and we shouldn't be employing it. And there are some historians of slavery who feel that it actually minimizes the oppression of slavery because we are always, looking at these heroic stories of resistance. I am not one of those. I feel that, in fact, looking at slave resistance also exposes the brutality of slavery, besides the ingenuity of people who resisted enslavement. I don't think it's a romanticized view of slavery at all because much of our stories of slavery resistance come from evidence, right? It comes from what we see in the historical sources. And so I think the most common misperception, especially amongst, I would say, people outside academia also, is that somehow enslaved people had no idea. They were so brutalized that they couldn't resist and that they had absolutely no sense of politics, that they had no political savvy or sophistication. What's interesting about the attempt of people to resist enslavement is to show that, that people were pretty politically savvy, that enslaved people, they may not have been literate, they overheard conversations, as Douglas recounts in his narrative and many other enslaved people do, that they knew the lay of the land, so that when the Civil War breaks out and hundreds and thousands of enslaved people start heading towards Union Army lines, even before emancipation is the formal goal of the Union during the Civil War, it shows how politically savvy enslaved people were. That they realized the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and in a way, they forced the Union Army and the United States government, including the president Lincoln, to actually move on emancipation. They set in motion the process of emancipation. I often say this, and I wrote an article on this, on how African Americans were the primary architects of their own liberation during this time. And the way I can make that argument is to show that the sort of mass defections of Black people to the Union Army sets in motion the emancipation process during the Civil War by creating a logistical and a political problem for the Union, making field commanders move on on emancipation, making Congress pass laws that says, do not return fugitive slaves to rebel slaveholders to the Confederacy, and finally the president himself, who decides to issue an Emancipation Proclamation fairly early in the war, already in the summer of 1862, even though the proclamation is formally issued on January 1st, 1863. So students always get astounded when I tell them, like, let's look at the story, the history of emancipation, and you can look at the ways in which Black people contributed to that story, especially when we look at the history of emancipation during the Civil War. But even before that, when I was writing my book on abolition, and I was looking at the way, for instance, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts abolished slavery, they abolished slavery because two enslaved people choose to sue their masters for their freedom. So, and that is the precedent that goes right down to Dred Scott, when the Supreme Court actually rules against Dred Scott. But Dred Scott wasn't doing anything remarkable by suing for his freedom. It was a very old tradition that went back to the colonial era and actually resulted in the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts saying that slavery is no longer consistent with the state's new constitution, new Republican constitution, with a small r, that is, representative constitution. And so if we just look at the history of slave resistance in the United States from the Revolution right down to the Civil War, you can see how enslaved people petitioning, suing for their freedom, running away against, they left behind this big testimony against slavery, but they also moved the pendulum of history towards abolition and emancipation.
Yeah, I mean, all these kind of examples and moments of resistance create a context, right? They create an atmosphere where, like, as you said, the pendulum has to move, like, especially during the Civil War. If you have this mass movement of people, we have to respond to it. And it does usher in kind of the legal components or the political components of abolition, but through the choices of Black Americans and, enslaved Americans at this time. One thing we talk a lot about in our curriculum is this idea, this thinking skill of historical significance. So why is history worth remembering? Like, why is a particular topic worth remembering? Because so often we can hear, and I'm sorry, students, but we hear like, well, why do I need to learn this, or why does this matter? And so help us understand that significance. Why is this worth our energy? Why is this worth understanding?
That's such a great question. As a historian, I would always say history matters, right? But I think a lot of our students today don't realize that how much our present is shaped by the past. If you study the history of the United States, which I think all good citizens of the United States should know and read, but you would also realize that history is not just like rote memorization of facts and figures and numbers and dates. It's really an understanding of our present and how we live with the legacies of the past. You can't understand your present or even know how much your own life is shaped by that past without dealing with that. history. So, we talked earlier about how I became interested in the subject and how I kind of worked my way back to slavery. And, if you look at the history of the Black protest tradition, the Black radical tradition, born in the fight against slavery, but then reemerges in the fight against Jim Crow and disfranchisement and racist violence in the South. Then you think of the civil rights movement, and then you think of contemporary movements, against the criminalization of blackness, or against police brutality, or against mass incarceration. You think of the Black Lives Matter movement that, some may be familiar with, which happened a few years ago. And we can't understand all that without understanding this past history. Many times people argue, why are we even talking about this? Slavery is dead and gone. Yes, it is, but many of its long afterlives continue down to our times. And many of those echoes of history continue down to our times. And that's why I think history is important. If you are interested in learning about our present condition, why is there a big debate over Confederate statues and the bringing down, for instance, of Confederate statues? And why is it that happened so late, only after the murder of George Floyd, right? Then you have to realize that we are still living with the long afterlives of slavery and the fight against slavery. And I'm not saying that, all of American history is just one way or the other way. I think
Sure.
that's too simple. I think when you look at US history, you realize that this has always been a contestation between good and bad ideas. And, and now the question is, which side are you on? And, it's okay if you feel that this is bad and that we shouldn't be talking about this, but then understand where that position is coming
Right.
from too, from the past, and understand what you are standing for today. So I've always taught history in that manner for my students. I don't tell them what to think politically or what to do. I teach them the history, and then they can themselves decide where they stand today on a host of issues.
Yeah, and I mean, even if we're to just compare this to our own personal lives, like we learn so much about ourselves in our present when we look back at our past, right? Like, what was my childhood like? What was my relationship with my friends like? How does this influence the way I engage with people today? And we're kind of expanding that self-reflection into a citizen reflection, which is really helpful for understanding the moment we live in. You touched on it slightly in your last answer, but what goal do you have for your students when you're engaging with this? How do you want them to walk out of your classroom?
So I want my students to really understand the full complexity of US history and to understand history in all respects. When I teach, I don't teach just one side or one part of history. It's important and those kinds of history is actually quite boring when you try to lay down the line, right? Oh, it was always all very good. Oh, it was always all very bad. Because then, what's the point? They're kind of simple, unnuanced histories. I want my students to know about the past in all its respects. So, that's why slave resistance is such a great topic, because slavery is a depressing topic, right? It's pretty brutal, it's awful. How could people be so awful and dehumanize people in this manner? But on the other hand, it is also a history of resistance. It's also a resistance of fighting back and winning, and looking at the ways in which, for instance, the movement to abolish slavery expanded the boundaries of democracy for everyone, right? And how it created our modern interracial democracy. So I want my students to understand all of that when they look at US history, whether it's the history of slavery, whether it's the history of abolition, or the Civil War and what happened after
Mm-hmm.
that, or Reconstruction and even the overthrow of Reconstruction, which was pretty awful. I want them to understand that full, rich history. And then it's like far more interesting to talk about and to debate, instead of having some one sort of fixed line that, oh, all of American history was this fantastic linear progress of freedom with no problems. We just kept including people who were previously excluded. And on the other hand, it's polar opposite, where, oh, all of American history is just all about racism and racist oppression and nothing ever changes. That too is simplistic and wrong. And so when my students leave, I don't want them to become too optimistic or too pessimistic. I want them to have the knowledge and to figure out how they, as ordinary citizens, can actually, contribute and move history, that history moves from the top and the bottom.
Hmm.
It's a great precedence, but also an enslaved person,
Yeah.
his freedom can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I mean, now I just want to dwell on that line. History moves from the top and the bottom. And that acknowledgement, I think, is so important in our study of the past.
Mhm.
Well, Dr. Sinha, thank you so much for this conversation, for helping us understand this historical moment a little bit better.
Thank you. My pleasure.